It is our pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Joanne Cafiero. Joanne is primarily a teacher, formerly a high school science teacher and special education AAC teacher. Joanne was Autism Projects Coordinator at Johns Hopkins Center for Technology and Education. She is consulting editor for Focus on Autism and Other Developmental Disabilities and Disability and Rehabilitation. She is on the Professional Advisory Board for the new national organization Autism Now and the Adult Autism Advocacy Group AutCom. She is the author of the first book on autism and AAC titled Meaningful Exchanges for People with Autism, An Introduction to AAC. She has written for the Council for Exceptional Children, Technology and Media Division, Closing the Gap, and Exceptional Parent. She has also written and guest edited for ASHA's Perspectives in AAC. Joanne teaches and works with schools and families nationally and internationally.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really excited to be able to share this information on autism and AAC and research-based best practices. So let's get started. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the features and types of AAC and correlate them with processing styles in autism, and look at evidence-based practices and talk about some promising and effective AAC interventions. I wanted to define evidence-based practice first and foremost with a model and definition we can live with. Of course, we know its current research findings, clinical expertise, and the stakeholders' perspective have to be taken into account. But we also want to look at real-life outcomes, even results that might be fuzzier with moving targets, and results that can generalize to complex, real conditions, multiple cultures, and settings. So I really want to expand that idea of what is evidence-based. Some of our friends with autism that we probably didn't think about, Bill Gates, that's rumored that he is on the autism spectrum, good old Bert, Thomas Jefferson, Temple Grandin, Albert Einstein, and Mozart. And the more I learn about autism from the adult autism community, they describe it to us, neurotypical people, as just part of the beautiful tapestry of human variation. When we look at the learning characteristics in autism, and I know we've all heard these over and over, but just review them quickly, they're visual processors for the most part. I'm going to talk about some new findings in the area of cognition. Multiple cue responding and stimulus over selectivity, and they are kind of two sides of the same coin. Difficulty in processing complex cues would be multiple cue responding, and stimulus over selectivity simply means that someone over-selects a particular stimulus, whether it's relevant or not. We know that people with autism have issues regarding social learning, there's sensory issues, and there's motor planning issues, which is another new area that we're going to talk about tonight. In terms of autism, and I hate the word mental retardation, but that's how the article reads, so I'm going to keep that integrity right there. Meredith Edelson did a beautiful study in 2006 where she investigated the idea that was in many, many research documents that 70 to 80% of people with autism also had cognitive delays. And when she really looked at that under a microscope, she found that 74% of those claims were from non-scientific sources, and 53% of that 74% wasn't traced to any data at all. And what she discovered was that people were using adaptive scores and adaptive measurements and calling them intelligence measurements. And most of these tools were language-based. So if someone couldn't answer a question, it was considered wrong. Therefore, all our information about autism and cognition and intelligence is pretty much skewed. Autism and motor planning is another area that is something that we really need to take a look at. And I have a lot of references here. You can go on my website if you want the complete information on those. But we're learning that not only from people with autism, but based on this research, that some of the motor issues begin showing up as early as 3 months of age. Difficulty sitting up, late walkers, when they do sit up, kind of toppling over, not having what they call a parachute reflex, where they catch themselves when they're beginning to tumble over just as they start to learn to sit up. So we're learning that autism is also, a large part of it is a motor issue and a motor planning issue, not so much a cognitive issue. So our conclusions are that motor issues are intrinsic to autism, and those soft signs which show up early, 3, 4, 5 months of age, may indicate autism. Perhaps if we shift our perspective to a movement difference, we may be better practitioners. And excuse me, the bottom line is people with autism may not be able to show what they know. This is backed up by people on the autism spectrum that are talking about something they call movement inertia. They can start doing something, but they can't stop, or they can't start at all. They tell us don't try to extinguish our behaviors because you're extinguishing the only way they have to communicate. Many AAC users with autism started out with support as typists. And I gave a couple of references there. Neurodiversity.com, Wrong Planet is another one, AutCom, Autism Self-Advocacy Network. These are websites that are well worth looking at because they're first-person accounts on the experience of having autism. Joel Smith describes real-time speech, what happens when you're discussing something with someone face-to-face, as extremely difficult. And even though he can speak, he prefers to type and then read what he typed when he's communicating. So this is all good information for those of us that are AAC practitioners. What kind of progress have we made? Well, deinstitutionalization happened 50 or 60 years ago. It was a terrible plight for people with disabilities. And so those institutions were closed. For people who test at 70 or above, their outcomes are better. And remember, the deficits in our testing instruments are huge. People who are testing between 50 and 70, and this is IQ and adaptive, are still dependent on others. And those individuals who are testing 50 or below have a dismal outcome even today, even after deinstitutionalization. Most of these people are nonverbal, so we do have a lot of work to do. What we know about communication in autism, and you probably have heard this many, many times, but 50% of people with autism have no functional language. 1/4 of them who develop language lose it, which is, a very disturbing fact. It's limited to requesting and refusing. They have inconsistent patterns of language expression and a unique developmental sequence of language skills. Sometimes symbolic language begins to emerge in adolescence. Either their signs become more sophisticated, or their use of AAC becomes more sophisticated, or speech becomes better. But what we know most importantly is that functional spontaneous communication is the key in facilitating positive outcomes. We know what AAC is, so I'll zip through this rather quickly. No prerequisites are required. It compensates for, replaces speech. It's multimodal. I'm going to talk about a student that I worked with who used sign, who used a high-tech AAC device and used picture boards and activity boards. She had no trouble toggling between all three of those. AAC, so it's multimodal. So AAC includes no-tech, low-tech, and high-tech, icons, tangible symbols, and text, and there's aided and unaided, but we're going to talk about aided today. So it includes all these things that we know: communication boards, schedules, keyboards, speech generating devices, portable electronic devices, apps, visual scene displays. There's a lot of myths out there about AAC and autism. Some of them are still persisting, much to my dismay, that AAC inhibits speech development, or it's not needed if a student has some speech. I hear this a lot. Well, he can talk, so he doesn't need a device. But usually the ability to talk and the vocabulary, the lexicon, is so limited that their life is defined into a small little crumb by their limited speech ability. Providing AAC ensures a student will use it. Well, there are lots of devices in closets and on shelves. The success or failure depends on a trial period. We don't know enough about kids with autism and language and communication to say, okay, we've tried enough, we're going to stop now. And we also don't know which are the best options, low or no tech or mid tech or high tech. We do know that whatever device you have, if it's a high tech device, you should create redundancy. In other words, you should have a low tech analog for that device, because sometimes things go wrong or get left home or need repair. ASHA's position on AAC is a powerful one. There's no evidence-based practice for determining if an individual could benefit from AAC. Therefore, no one should be denied based on some arbitrary criteria. Eligibility should be based on needs alone. So we know that aided and unaided AAC is effective for people with autism, and they use it for requesting, choice making, escaping things they don't like. We know that based on research that children who have good object exploration skills usually have more speech development using AAC. We know that aided AAC modestly increases speech for those with good verbal imitation skills. That sign as functional spontaneous communication requires good fine motor skills, and time delay. This is really important. Time delay increases more speech production, and most of us don't really put enough time between a comment that we make or a question and the time that that student with autism takes to process and give a response. Non-speaking is not a fixed condition. So we have people with autism that do become speaking communicators. And the most important thing is progress in AAC is dependent on the commitment and the competence of the communication partner, and that's you and me. So I want to talk a little bit about evidence, because that's a big word these days. Using evidence to apply specific interventions to specific kids with autism. And here's our problem. There is a lack of evidence for general autism methods. And the problem is that even ABA, strict ABA, which of course is what's gotten us all off our bottoms to really do better things for kids with autism, we have found that in replicating the original Lovaas study, there's been a lot of difficulties there. It has not been replicated as his study was written. And in fact, we found that the study states that this meta-analysis of all the Lovaas replication sites states that in every one of these replication sites, there was a small group of children that did not make progress in strict ABA, and in fact, some of them regressed. We also know in pivotal response treatments, which is the strongest ABA strategy for kids with autism, there's a subgroup of kids who don't do well with that. So we don't know how to match an intervention to a student in general for autism. So certainly matching a device to a kid is also very difficult. So we are creating best practices right now as we live it. We do know that motor planning on accessing AAC is a big issue, because if they can't make the motor plan to access a device, we might make the assumption that they either have nothing to say or don't have the ability to say it. And then we have the universal explosion of technology, which has been a wonderful thing, but also complicates issues because we have fabulous technology and we're not quite sure how to match a particular device to a particular student, because we don't know how to match really most interventions for kids with autism to a particular autism features of a child. So that's a little depressing, but that's where we are right now. So in light of what we don't know about autism, we have to make the least harmful assumptions regarding the potential of that student. We have to assume that every one of our students has at least average intelligence. We have to operate from that assumption always. So the ultimate goal of AAC is spontaneous novel utterance generation, so to be able to say anything about anything at any time, which is certainly something that we can do and we would want for our students with autism. We know that aided AAC and autism have a wonderful feature match, and I'm not going to go over this. You've probably heard me say it many times, but we know that the characteristics of autism have a wonderful feature match with the features of AAC. When we're doing an assessment, what we want to think about is what's the learning characteristics of that student? What are the communication environments? What are their preferences and perspectives? Who are the communication partners? And certainly be sure that there's an ownership of the device and language among all communication partners. Assessment should be continuous. There should be a continuous cycle of assessment and intervention as we expand vocabulary, or sometimes have to contract vocabulary to make it easier for some of the kids that are having some motor planning issues. But bottom line is that an assessment should never be a gatekeeper, as ASHA tells us. We don't lock out any kids from AAC because we don't know enough yet to do that. Evidence-based practices, picture exchange, of course, is the big one. Functional communication training, replacing a aberrant behavior with a communicative behavior. The augmented input strategies and speech-generating devices, and these all overlap with each other. They're not hard and fast separate categories. We know that visual supports is probably the AAC 101 for people with autism, and there's lots of different visual supports that we all use. When you have visual supports, you acknowledge that visual input is as important as auditory input, sometimes more important. Visual supports have an authority with people with autism. We're not quite sure exactly why it's so powerful. We just know it is. So you can give someone with autism a verbal cue, another verbal cue, but if you pair it with a picture cue, you're going to get more understanding. This is a within activity schedule. This is a reinforcer puzzle for kids that don't quite understand the relationship between a token and a reward. So here, each part of a token is part of the reward, which is a pretzel, and then we use the letters to really reinforce literacy learning. Contingency maps. Pat Miranda does a lot of these with her people, and it just basically is a mini social story, all visual supports. Task boards. What do you have to do? How many do you have to do? What do you do? What do you get when you're done doing it? These are all things that we are all using. Let's talk a little bit about problem behavior, because this certainly impacts the implementation of AAC. There's a strong inverse relationship between problem behavior and communication skills. That is an axiom that I think we need to all hang on to. Functional communication training with aided AAC is one of the ways that we can address problem behavior, and it can include picture symbols, symbol sticks, objects, speech generating devices, all the things that are part of AAC. But in addressing a problem behavior, we have to view all behavior as communicative. You replace aberrant behavior with communication, and that replacement has to be as efficient, as acceptable, and as recognizable as the aberrant behavior in getting that person what they need. In Pat Miranda's review of functional communication training, she found that when it was done, there was an immediate, substantial, and sustained decrease in aberrant behaviors. That's pretty powerful stuff. Choice making. AAC is great for choice making, either using an app for choice making, or photographs or symbol sticks. And we find that choice making is much easier because it requires less cognitive effort when there's a symbol or an AAC device. Reinforcement can be more immediate, and it also increases positive behaviors and initiation. Now, this is some examples of some choices people can make, and also addresses some of the communicative functions of some difficult behaviors. So the advantage of high-tech over low-tech, well, they're pretty obvious. Low-tech is cheaper, of course. High-tech has got a huge prestige factor to it. There's auditory feedback. You can summon a communication partner. There's models for speech. It may be difficult if there's a language within a language. What we're finding is that we're using high-tech and low-tech. And actually, those of us that are typical speakers have more problem toggling between them than most of our little campers with autism. I want to talk a little bit about James, one of our little guys. 6 years old. He had 3 years of no-tech communication. Barking was his primary requesting behavior. And we introduced high-tech AAC for just academics using aided language and augmented input. And we found that as his functional vocabulary increased, his self-injurious behavior decreased. And there's showing the data on that. And it happened fairly quickly from the beginning of the school year in 2008 in August. By the middle of October, we saw an explosion in his functional vocabulary. and a concurrent decrease in his self-injurious behavior. Augmented input strategies is, as far as I'm concerned, it's what we should be doing with any device, whether it's a single picture that says I need a break, or a sophisticated system like Proloquo to Go. As communication partners, we need to be giving the input, using that naturally as a way to provide receptive language to our non-speaking or limited speaking communication partner. And there's some nice research that I did, Mark Dexter did, Marcia Atchison at University of Cincinnati did some research also on modeling language using AAC. So I'm calling that the augmented input strategies. Romski, Sevcik, and their colleagues did a wonderful study on what they call the system for augmenting language, and it uses the same model. The speaking partner integrates the AAC device into their own speech as they talk to the person that is ultimately going to be the device user. And they had 3 groups. They were randomly placed. In group 1, they didn't use AAC, and they taught the parents to use speech only to stimulate speech. Group 2, they used aided AAC with a focus on comprehension, augmented input. And group 3, they taught the parents to use augmented input, but also to teach the child to generate output. And this system for augmenting language is a little description of it, where I already talked about that. You integrate the speech generating device into your own spoken language. And they found that in the group ACI, which was the input and the output group, those children were able to communicate using symbols after 18 sessions, and they generalized and maintained their language at home. In the speech-only group, the parents who used speech to help these kids learn to generate language, they could only produce a few words by 18 sessions and had no conventional way to communicate while learning to speak. And the ACI and ACO group had greater increases in type token ratio, so they were using a greater variety of words and a proportion of intelligible utterances. So that's a really powerful study. I want to talk a little bit about applied behavior analysis, because you can't talk about autism and avoid talking about ABA. And I know that I mentioned that strict ABA, although children make gains in strict ABA programs, there's a subgroup of kids that not only don't make gains, but actually do regress. So we have a great deal of work to do. But under that ABA umbrella, we've got verbal behavior, we have aided language, discrete trial, pivotal response treatments, and incidental teaching. That's a few, there's others as well. I want to talk about pivotal response treatments because it is the strongest ABA strategy for kids with autism and adults. They're actually doing it with young adults now as well. I have 100 plus published studies, there's actually 200. And pivotal response treatments has all the features of a good AAC intervention. They're the most effective ABA strategies, but what we want to do is think about what are the features of PRT, pivotal response treatments, that we can wed to AAC so that we can have observable, measurable interventions, because that's what we need. We need some good evidence. So we're going to talk about that. Pivotal response treatments and the aided language strategies are very similar. We use shared control. We never use a device to quiz. We use a device for connection between people. We use natural reinforcers. The reinforcer is embedded in the activity. We mix new vocabulary with mastered vocabulary. The communication partner, the speaking partner, extends the engagement with the students, and all attempts to communicate are reinforced. And so aided language as an observable, measurable intervention allows us to measure a lot of things: initiations and responses, total words, the prompted or unprompted use of AAC, echolalia, responsivity, how often the child responds according to how many opportunities they have to respond, lexical variety, affect, are the kids happy? That's really important. And how well is the communication partner implementing this particular intervention, which is an aided language intervention. And we can use any sort of device to do this: an app, speech generating device, a communication board, a pod. This is a little case study about Zach. He was in my doctoral study quite a while ago, but it went really well. And here we just use a communication board, just a placemat. And we found that as his mother gave him more communicative input, he gave her more output. And you can see intervention week 3 where her input dropped, so did his output. We also found that her perception of his autistic symptoms on the childhood autism rating scale was actually less after he was able to use communication devices using AAC, that her perception of his autism was he was less severely disabled. And her stress also decreased as well. Timothy was a student in my class where he had learned 5 signs in 5 years before he came to me. And basically all we did was we increased his aided input from 9 symbols to 60 symbols. So he went from this, which is a miserable communication board, to something more complicated. I'm sure if iPads and Proloquo to Go were available in those days, he would have taken off with it. So by increasing the input we gave him, he gave us more output. So here at baseline, where we're just giving input of 9 symbols, he's only giving us about 3 to 4 symbols back. Once we started giving him input with more symbols, he was giving us initiating with more. After extended school year, his initiations went down. I didn't teach him, and this was in the 80s. So I think even though I sent his communication boards on to the summer school teacher, I don't think he knew what to do with them. It was the early days of AAC. When he came back to my class, when we resumed giving him input, he began generating more output and went up to 30 and even higher than that. Incidentally, his bolting decreased. So this was a kid who was running away, probably because his instruction was so boring because we didn't know how bright he really was. When we think about aided language, we need to think about typical babies and toddlers. How long do we talk to babies and toddlers before we expect them to start talking? There's no timeline, is there? Not 1 month, 3 months, or 1 year. We don't say, well, I've been talking to this kid enough. He's not going to talk to me, so I'm done. That would be ridiculous. So, and likewise, when we come to talk about aided language, we don't know how much time we have to give aided language input. But if that child or that student or your child is paying attention while you're using that device, you are on your way to helping them develop a symbolic language. So aided language is not quizzing. It's not saying touch this or do this. It's not hand over hand, and it's not communication boards only, and it's not restricted to 100% nonverbal individuals either. So you're modeling everything: verbs, nouns, descriptors, syntax, pragmatics, the operational use of vocabulary, mistakes and repair strategies. We're modeling everything. So aided language is a mother tongue method. And in order to do it, you have to practice and kind of change your mind about what it is to be a communication partner for someone with autism using a device. So you have to develop a habit of augmenting the input by using that device yourself. That means you have to know the device. You have to know where vocabulary is. And if you don't, you're modeling looking for it. So it's a win-win all the way around. And communication partnerships have to be taught, not only for the speaking communication partner, but for the challenged speaker. I want to talk about a study that I did 2 years ago with teachers and students where I coached them in increasing their input that they were giving to their students. This is Selena, and after each session that she worked with Adam, I gave her written feedback. And what happened was we began expanding the vocabulary that we were using with this student, and we were probing the intervention, each of the intervention times. So I was actually measuring not only what Adam was doing, but what Selena was doing. And so this is eventually what happened. From a simple bubble activity, we began adding a whole lot more words and a whole lot more ideas and concepts. And we wanted to look at the fidelity of implementation in aided language. So what she had to do was select, prepare reinforcing materials, and have her device ready, and she had to know how to use that device. She had to make sure she had the child's attention and refocus his attention. Now, she selected bubbles because it's something he liked. She used expectant delay. She modeled the use of language with the device. She acknowledged, reinforced all attempts with augmentative communication. She shaped his language and she expanded his language through modeling with the device, and she withheld the target until he gave her the language or the expanded language that she had targeted as his objective. So this is an example of a communication partner checklist, and this is borrowed from pivotal response treatments. Excuse me. Pivotal response treatments does not use AAC. As a matter of fact, they are focused on speech only, but we're using some of their the features of PRT, and as I said, wedding them to AAC use in an aided language format. And so I worked with Selena to see how many of these areas she did address during her 10-minute interaction with Adam. And then we looked at progress over time. So I would review this after she was done. We did some videotaping. We did some video modeling where she got to see herself doing exactly what she needed to do. And so we looked at fidelity of implementation from a short period of time, from May 20th to June 7th. And you can see that she implemented more of the characteristics of, or the features of doing an aided language intervention over time with coaching. And we also found that as she did that, Adam was using more vocabulary. As she was modeling using more words, he was giving her more words back, and that's lexical variety. He was also more responsive, meaning that he responded using language to more WH questions and comments that she made. So communication opportunities don't just happen. Selena had to make them happen. They're overtly or covertly embedded in everyday routines, and you either recognize them or you create them by doing some of the things that we know are tried and true things to help communication happen. You engineer the environment, you do creative sabotage, interrupted behavior chain, and of course, good old time delay. We're going to talk a little bit about core and fringe vocabulary because both are required for communication, and we know core is more open-ended and applicable to many situations. Fringe is more specific. Most of our devices now have core and fringe kind of integrated together. We're just finding that our kids with autism can just navigate anything much better than we can often. We've got to do a little more homework than they do. This is an example, a very simplified example of core and fringe for one of the teachers I'm working with who uses low-tech communication boards during her cooking activities. And she's got the core vocabulary for preparing something that the kids really like to eat, you know, comments like, I don't want it, or it's yummy. And then the fringe is related to the particular item that they're making. Here it's toaster waffles. Here's Lindsay and Jake, and they're using a high-tech speech generating device. He's 4 years old, and he uses a combination of low-tech communication boards and high-tech speech generating devices. The teacher selected highly reinforcing array of wind-up toys, and she employed the principles of aided language. This teacher got videotape and written feedback weekly. And we found also over the 3 probes that the initiations with speech-generating devices and the use of speech increase with both for the student and for the teacher. So initially, when I was working with this teacher, she was doing a lot hand over hand. Touch this one, you know, I'll show you. Once I captured her doing it right, and I had a couple of snippets, I showed her an edited video of exactly what a good aided language intervention looked like, gave her some written feedback, and then she was on her way. Amber was a student that I worked with several years ago with the first generation Proloquo to Go. And she was in full inclusion, severe self-injurious behavior, never had AAC before, had some speech, but she was had a somewhat short fuse. So when she had a difficult time, she could not access any speech. Within 2 minutes, she gave us some novel information to me as her communication partner using Proloquo to Go. It was really quite remarkable. And we have several videos that I believe that we're going to show of Proloquo to Go on an iPad. And I think this is a good place to kind of talk about those and see those videos and see that for some of our kids with autism, the reinforcement is built into the device. They love the device. It's been quite remarkable with lots of our kids. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about autism, iPads, iPods, and apps. You know, as far as universal design for learning, it's just very, very powerful. It's undeniable that it's turning our world upside down in a wonderful way. We've got powerful anecdotal and observational reports. What we're finding is there's a very short orientation time to the device. Some of our kids are immediately responsive. We need empirical studies. And we want to keep in mind the broad evidence-based practices model, where we're looking not only at stakeholder perspectives, current research, and practitioners' experience, but what kinds of interventions are bringing us those outcomes that generalize across people, environments, and activities. And sometimes, you know, you can get good empirical evidence for an intervention that is not very meaningful. So we have to keep in mind that we want to expand that whole idea of evidence-based practices model. Let's expand it and look at evidence as we want to get the science in there for sure, but we also want to look at, does this generalize across people, environments, and activities? I want to talk a little bit about pods. Gail Porter and Linda Burkhart. And again, this is something that's having some very compelling applications for kids with autism, and we're using it in our classrooms where I'm a consultant. In particular, for kids who do have some speech, but when they have a meltdown, they have no speech at all, and the teacher takes out the pod and either finds out what the problem is, or just the presence of the pod and the conversation and the low-key interaction of providing aided language input to that student has really mitigated a lot of the difficulties we've had with kids. We know that it's a complex, low-tech device, complex architecture using pragmatic branch starters. It was originally developed for children with physical disabilities, but it's very promising for the field of autism. This is a very simplified version of a pod page showing you have a category on the top, a quick word, and there's 4 quick words. The next category would be something I want to read, I want to listen to music. Here's what I think. And there's some comments and then help, but this is a very, very simplified. And partner-assisted scanning is the process that you use to make a pod happen. So rather than the scanning happening with an electronic device, you're an intelligent scanner. You're the human being that will point to each one to see which particular icon represents what the student wants to say. And that is a terribly simplified version of pods and partner-assisted scanning, but I did want to address it as something promising for autism. I just want to talk a little bit about Celeste and Michelle, which was a little mini study we did with one of our students, and I alluded to that earlier. She has some speech, but when she's having a difficult time, she has no speech. So we found that when she had a pod available and her teacher, Celeste, modeled the language to say, well, what's the problem? Or how can I help you with? And pointing to each symbol as she talks, that there was an immediate de-escalation of anxiety and concurrent aggression. So we found, in addition to that, over time, we found that the more experience that Michelle and Celeste had using the pod, the more Michelle's echolalia dropped and her variety of language increased. And this is all by giving aided language input through the pod. So again, we're always talking about communication partners providing aided language input, whether the device is a pod, Proloquo to Go, Springboard, whatever. That's really essential. And it's tough because that means the practitioner has to know the device. I want to talk a little bit about Lily. This is a little girl who has a sign language interpreter. She has autism. Very, very complex, active little girl. She received augmented input through everything. She's got sign language. She has adapted literature. She's got communication boards. She has an iPad with Proloquo to Go, and she has a springboard. Now, you'd think, my gosh, that'd be awfully confusing. But interestingly, we looked at her saying, well, her first language is ASL. Her second language, high-tech AAC. Her third language is text because she's reading, and her fourth language is speech. But we found when we did the expressive and receptive one-word picture vocabulary test, lo and behold, we found that when we combined her sign, one-word expressive and receptive with the vocabulary she had on the device, she had a greater vocabulary than the other kids that didn't have all these, the benefit of these things. But in addition, that she had a greater vocabulary with the device than she did with sign, which of course we know with kids with autism, the fine motor issues kind of preempts them from being really fluent signers. So when we're using devices with people with autism, what about those folks that aren't giving us much of a response? The ones that we say, well, nothing's going on here, you know, they're not processing, you know, we're just going to give up, or keep them on PECs. It's something else that happens a lot. Let's look for those subtle signs of communication behaviors. Are they physically close to you when you're using the device? Are they looking at the device? Are they shifting from icon to icon? We've got to really pay attention. Sometimes videotaping allows us to pick up, you know, this student is really paying attention to this device. Shifting attention from the device to the partner. Attention shifting is a sophisticated motor skill. Lots of kids with autism have difficulty with it. Global change in behavior or modeling or imitating the partner. That's all good stuff. Expressive behaviors, sometimes orienting or shifting their body or their arms towards the device. Remember, we know now that there's some pretty serious motor planning challenges for people in the autism spectrum. Visual shifting, scanning icons, any movement of the body, pay attention to that. Vocalizing or any change in affect or behavior. I want to talk briefly about literacy before we close, because you can't separate literacy from AAC. They are, you know, inextricably combined and woven together. Print is a visual medium and communication is a core challenge. So just those two reasons alone, targeting the visual processing skills and knowing how communication will change the quality of a person's life, really demands that we address literacy. The adults that I know now, the adult autism advocacy movement that I've been so privileged to be part of, talk about real-time speech and how hard that is, and how easy texting and keyboard communication is. Sometimes these are speaking communicators, and I talked about this earlier this evening, decide they would rather use AAC than speak, that speech is too hard. They have to process listening to what their communication partner is saying, process that, craft a response, and then generate the response back. It's much easier to do that with a keyboard than it is to do that face-to-face. So keyboarding may be a primary means of functional spontaneous communication and spontaneous novel utterance generation. Writing, as likewise, writing, keyboard vocus, alphabet boards, Post-its, whiteboards, keyboards, these are all things that are important for those people with autism that have emerging literacy skills. And we have a lot of closet readers on the autism spectrum. These are people and children that we thought couldn't read, and they're reading and comprehending. I talk about Post-its as the cheapest AAC device. Anyway, writing as input, writing as communication. When we talk about writing, then as a speaking communication partner, we need to give them input, written input. Just talk a little bit about some basic. There's a homeschool journal using a no-tech device, which is just a laminated file folder. But here's a very basic writing using picture symbols or symbol sticks or whatever you would like to use, or words only if you have a speaking a literate communicator, and then you can have a word bank. So in this homeschool journal, this student can tell his mom and dad what he did at school. These icons right here, mommy, daddy, school, worked, math, ate, pizza, went outside, are all part of a word bank. So Danny has to find those, put them on his with this handy little Velcro and put him on his writing frame. And that's a very easy way for him to express what he did at school. But keyboard communication is very important, and I think that's going to be another explosion for us. It's great that our devices now all have keyboards. The adult autism advocacy movement is really screaming for more keyboarding instruction for people with autism. And I talked about keyboard communication as being easier than face-to-face because they don't have to deal with processing so much, processing what they hear and processing responses at the same time. It's important for us to think about the qualitative difference between our own spoken language and our written language, because we too may communicate differently with a keyboard. Former speaking communicators as adults have transitioned to AAC, and the model is the same. We want to give consistent augmented input, even with keyboarding. So about communication partnerships. The speaking communication partner must view AAC as the voice in the ears of the student, not as this tool or toy or gizmo, but sometimes I'll go to see a teacher working with a student, and maybe they're in PE or music and their device isn't there. Well, where's their device? Well, he really doesn't use it here. Well, you wouldn't take a hearing aid out of the ears of a student who was hearing impaired because they were going to a class where you thought it wasn't relevant. So we don't have a communication device put away because of some arbitrary reason. They don't need it there, or they have nothing to say in that particular environment. The speaking communication partner must use the device, pairing the speech with AAC to acknowledge what the child or student is communicating, to repair, to expand, and to model. And the communication partner's investment is essential for a successful AAC intervention. I think most interventions do not succeed because the communication partner is not invested in it, and therefore the student is not going to be invested in it. They might be invested in it to explore on their own, but not invested in it as a way to connect with someone else. So the principles of AAC interventions, it should be ubiquitous across all environments. And communication partners, the speaking partners, that's us. We must create repeated planned communication opportunities to get our students jump-started to use AAC. We never use a wait-and-see approach. We ask, how can AAC be applied, not if AAC can be applied. So if you can take this home with you, we want to make sure that you give augmented communicative input. You as the communication partner are critically important to the success of that intervention. Assume that every student with autism, especially those with the most difficult behaviors, have the potential to communicate. And that's, again, making the least harmful assumption. We want to assume that every one of your students with autism, especially the ones with the most outrageous behaviors, have at least average intelligence. We will approach them in a qualitatively different way if we make that assumption. Remember that AAC helps develop language. It's not just unlocking language. For some of our kids, there's some disordered language up there. AAC helps provide an order and a structure to language. We don't want to place arbitrary timelines on the intervention because learning a language takes time. And of course, functional spontaneous communication is the most important life-enhancing skill that an individual with autism can learn. So that is the end of my presentation on autism and AAC.